And the object of this discussion is not some abstract or outside phenomena called consciousness. It is each of ours own consciousness that we are talking about here. And so to help us to, as the foundation for this discussion, to identify the subject of it, I'm going to take us through a little three-part contemplation or investigation of each of our own consciousnesses. So I'd like to ask you to follow along with me to investigate, to discover, to identify, to realize, to be your own consciousness. You can do this with your eyes open or your eyes closed as you wish. So to begin, let's begin with the very seemingly simple, but perhaps extremely difficult task of seeing if we can see, identify, or find our own consciousness. So let's just do that for a minute or so. So in doing that, have you found that, in fact, what you are looking at or focusing on is not consciousness itself, but the objects of consciousness, the objects of experience, the perceptions outside us, the thoughts and the feelings inside of us. But in this particular case, we are looking for the consciousness itself, not what it is conscious of. We are looking for the experiencer itself rather than what is being experienced. So let's, in a very famous formulation from the Zen Buddhist tradition, take the backward step. Turn the light inward. See if you can identify not the experiences you are having, but identify or experience the consciousness, the experiencer itself. Now, to the extent that you have seen or realized or experienced your own consciousness, ask yourself some questions about it. Has your consciousness got a shape? Has it got a form? Has it got a color? Has it got a locality? Has it got an identity? Is it in one place? Is it everywhere? Is it nowhere? Is it you? Is it not you? Is it a way that you experience things, or is it in fact the source of those things itself? So let's just take a final little moment here and see what we can say about this consciousness that we are currently living and that we are currently trying to investigate. Thank you very much. We've now, in effect, introduced ourselves to the subject of this discussion, which is to say, your own consciousness, and how best to work with that consciousness in order to have a fruitful, meaningful, beneficial, and happy life. So our first speaker I would like to introduce is Anne Harrington. She is a professor for the science of history at Harvard University. As an historian, she is particularly interested in psychiatry and mental health, in body-mind medicine, and in understanding what neuroscience may or may not have to say about what it means to be human. She's in the first stages of a new book about the quest in science to understand consciousness. Anne?
Thank you. So I want to just start by saying I'm so happy to be speaking to this group, but I am particularly thrilled that there are so many students in the audience. Students are some of my, it's one, particularly all of you are high school students? Yeah. Say again, what? Some university. Anyway, I'm thrilled. I'm really, really excited to be talking to everybody, but it was such a thrill to see how many students came in. So, as Melvin explained, I am an historian, a particular kind of historian, an historian of science and medicine. But I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, and nor am I a practitioner of of a contemplative practice. But as an historian, I want to share with you one of the craziest things I've learned. The world we live in didn't have to end up this way. The assumptions that we take for granted, they weren't always assumed by people in the past. They had to get forged and made and fought for us to take them now for granted today. Our beliefs about who we should talk to, what we should find interesting, of course, in some sense, they're ours, but often we're drawn to them because we live in spaces that have been shaped by choices that other people in the past have made for us. People who have made their own choices, have their own stories, but whose choices and stories we usually have forgotten or never knew, but the legacies of which still shape our lives. So I want to kind of make the argument that in spite of what a lot of you probably thought or learned about history when you took it in school, or maybe are still taking it, history is not just about the past. It's about understanding and engaging more effectively with projects in our present moment, because this present moment is not given to us, it's made. So here's a little plea, it matters. Now, it was mentioned, Melvin mentioned that as an historian, I'm in the early stages of trying to think about how I can apply this way of thinking to one of the biggest projects in science, us, our consciousness, our awareness, the things that make us fundamentally human. And the way I've been thinking through this project is by doing what I often like to do when I'm starting a new project. I've been teaching about it. I've been gathering students into a classroom, and we've been trying to figure things out together. And the argument that I've been trying to persuade my students of is that there isn't, you might think there's the scientific quest to understand consciousness. There isn't a single quest. There isn't a single conversation. There are many conversations. There are many quests. Each of them have their own history, their own logic, and only some of them end up connecting up with one another. And to understand why there are so many conversations, I've been trying to also persuade my students of a different point: the power and importance of place. Places, spaces, both literal spaces and also imaginary spaces, spaces of our imagination, profoundly shape the kinds of conversations we tend to have, and the kinds of projects that we consider important. So, for example, conversations about consciousness look one way when you're in an ICU and family members are begging the doctors to tell them whether that beloved family member who is in a coma, is he still there? Is there someone still inside? Is there someone still at home? And will they ever come back? That's a certain kind of conversation about consciousness. There's a very different kind of conversation that you might have if you go to, say, a sleep lab, and people start asking questions about dreaming. And what kind of a conscious state is it? It's not like our ordinary consciousness, but it's not the same as being unconscious. What is it? Or when you go into a hospice and you bear witness to the experiences of a dying person who is maybe having deathbed visions. Or you're swimming underwater with octopi. Nervous systems radically different from our own, but who seem profoundly aware. Or maybe you're hanging out in a tech workspace like Google, and you're having a conversation with a chatbot, and you're disconcerted by how apparently aware the chatbot seems to be. So these are the kinds of things I've been doing in this class, and in this class, my students and I get curious about two things. First, how each of these spaces that enable these different kinds of conversations got made, and how they function in our own time. And this takes me to this space, because we're in a space too, an our moment. So here I'm on a panel with an old friend of mine named Cliff, and a new friend of mine named Gaylon. Cliff is a neuroscientist. Gaylon is a Buddhist spiritual practitioner. And I want to be curious about this, like, why Buddhism? Why neuroscience? Why not other spiritual traditions, other scientific traditions? Why bring them together? Why not just stick to one or stick to the other? And asking these questions doesn't mean that I or anyone is questioning that Buddhism has rich, interesting things to say about consciousness. It doesn't mean that neuroscience isn't a brilliant branch of science that has a lot to teach us about the mind. All it means is that because we know from history that every space, every conversation in every space is made and is therefore constrained by certain assumptions, that there's interest and also power in trying to understand how they get made and why they look the way they do. So what would be interesting for us to know about this space? Well, historians like to tell stories, and I'm going to therefore try to give you an answer by telling you briefly a little story about something that took place more than a century ago. In 1893, and it's also a story that I am wagering is familiar to at least some of you who are regular participants in the Festival of Faiths, because it's one of its most important predecessors. It might be what you would consider like the original Festival of Faiths. It took place in Chicago, and it was called the World Parliament of Religions. And basically, for 17 days, representatives from faith traditions from the West and the East interacted, explained themselves to one another. They forged new kinds of friendships, new forms of understanding. Basically, they actually helped to launch, this event helped to launch the interfaith movement of which all of us are beneficiaries today. But this event, I think I have a kind of, let me see if I can, I can, somewhere there's a, oh, there we go. This event, I just want to gesture. This event also left another legacy that may be less well known than the one I just outlined, because it was at this meeting that we first see Buddhist spiritual leaders, people who had come from places like Japan and Sri Lanka, arguing that Buddhism brought a special virtue to the table. Its approaches to spiritual life, its claims about reality, they said, were deeply compatible with the claims of modern Western science. And there's something you need to know. Let me just show you this is sort of what some of the people who are making these arguments, here are some of the folks at this meeting. And there is something you need to know about what they were doing when they made this argument. Because it isn't that the version of Buddhism that they presented was not authentic, but it is the case that it was of a very definite reformist and modern kind. It was an understanding of Buddhism that downplayed ritual and text and emphasized instead experience and inquiry, and there was definitely a politics at play in their decision to insist on the compatibility of their tradition with that of Western science. Because they'd come to Chicago in 1893 in a time when modernist forces back home and colonialist forces back home were putting their spiritual traditions at risk. And so insisting now on the compatibility of those traditions with modern science was a way to both fight for their relevance back home and to win new supporters abroad. The strategy worked. At least it worked for the audience in Chicago, and it worked for another really important reason, because it was made against a background understanding of the time that Christianity, which is the dominant Western religious tradition, was actually having a hard time with science. In particular, it was having a hard time reconciling biblical understandings of human nature and human origins with new understandings like you're seeing here. Oops, hang on. There it is. Of Darwinian evolutionary theory, arguing that we, in fact, evolved from lower life forms. And so the view around Christianity was that, in contrast to what these folks were saying about Buddhism, the Christian view and the scientific view were, at best, uneasy parallel worlds. At worst, they were in a state of open warfare. And here you see some of the classic writings at the time about this. But maybe Buddhism was different. And if so, maybe it offered a way to bring the science and the spiritual together. That was the claim made in 1893, and the big takeaway I want to just make clear is that the idea has had legs. It's had legs, but it hasn't had legs in the sense that there's been a kind of consistent story about Buddhism and science in dialogue. Instead, what you see is a lot of shifting understandings around what science we want to be in conversation with and what understanding of Buddhism we want to be in conversation with. So in the early years, a big focus was on Buddhism's alleged compatibility with exactly those parts of science that Christianity allegedly found most threatening. But in the 1940s and 50s, the focus shifted to Buddhism as a theory of mind, particularly, and then the science that was deemed most relevant to learning from Buddhism wasn't neuroscience. It was something no one even knows anything about anymore, psychoanalysis. This system associated with names like Sigmund Freud that was interested in freeing people from the tyranny of their unconscious minds. And here you see a very prominent teacher in the mid-20th century of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, T.D. Suzuki, saying the concept of the unconscious is the foundation of Zen Buddhism. But then sometime in the 70s and 80s, meditation in the West became increasingly framed by new generations of teachers, not just as practices for achieving enlightenment, but as wellness practices that could assist in the goal of expanding human consciousness, stabilizing human consciousness, improving our capacity to flourish. And this set the stage. Oh, by the way, anyone on this first guy on the left, anyone over 40, who is it? So we don't have time to go into him, but he is a critically important figure in the reimagining of meditation into this space. And this sets the stage for our own moment that has identified brain science as a natural partner for a dialogue with Buddhism, and particularly has identified meditation as a focus for dialogue between these two traditions, in the hope that together these two traditions can help us better understand how to tame our unruly conscious minds, how to become more fully human. And we should be surprised about this, just a little bit, because in other spaces, not this one, neuroscience doesn't seem like it's a discipline that is particularly friendly to spiritual conversations. You're looking here at an article from 1997 by a journalist named Ton Wolfe, and the title says it all, "Sorry, but your soul just died." And you can see he goes on to say, "It's the great intellectual event of the late 20th century. New discoveries in neuroscience are challenging our established ideas about morality, free will, and human nature." So maybe neuroscience is really the field that's going to flatten our humanness and turn it into a bunch of meaningless chemical and electrical interactions. The fact that we're here, though, suggests there's a bigger and more complicated story, that there's been another cultural reframing to allow for dialogue to happen. There's a particularly, I'm just going to throw up one last slide, the dialogue within the Buddhist neuroscience space that had around, that's particularly tended over the years to focus on a form of Buddhism that previously had not actually played a big role in these conversations, Tibetan Buddhism. And a big reason I put this slide up is Cliff took the picture. And I'm hoping in our dialogue we can talk a little bit about this space and how it's contributed to the events that have led to this panel. But charismatic individuals have mattered a lot in this space. D.T. Suzuki mattered a lot to the conversations in the 1950s. The Dalai Lama of Tibet has mattered a lot to the conversations in the 1990s and beyond. So where does this land us? I think back in where we began, but maybe with some new understandings that we understand that specific visions of dialogue between spiritual traditions and science are given, are not given, they're made. We know that they've varied over time in ways that have reflected the preoccupations of different historical moments. We also know that the making of every dialogue requires work on both sides, requires translations, reframings, decisions to focus selectively on this rather than some other point of view, finding common ground while potentially avoiding other areas that might feel less compatible. And there's one last thing I'll say that I think we now understand, which is that the original decision to privilege Buddhism in this modern effort to bring science and spirituality together happened at a particular moment for a particular historical reason. It's been fruitful, but it doesn't mean that we have to be locked into a future that fails to be curious about other spiritual traditions, other world faiths that might, if they were asked to join the party, also have something to contribute to this conversation. And it seems to me that cultivating that final kind of curiosity is exactly what any kind of festival of faith should ask of us all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate that you have brought us here right now to where we are by noting the kind of space we are in, the kind of conversation we are having, and its history. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, as I said, this is not in any way an intellectual, scientific, or philosophical discussion. This is about us here right now together, experiencing our consciousness together and contemplating its nature together. Our next speaker is Cliff Saron, PhD. He's a research scientist at the Center for Mind and Brain and Mind Institute at the University of California in Davis. Starting in 2003, Cliff has been the principal investigator of the Shamatha Project, a multidisciplinary longitudinal investigation of the effects of meditation on physiological and psychological processes central to well-being and health. His other research area focuses on sensory processing in children with autism with children across the autism spectrum. His talk now is entitled The Whole in Context. A neuroscientist contemplates consciousness and the unknowable.
Thank you, Melvin, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Anne, for a wonderful talk that illuminates so many pots of sparkling oil boiling on a stove that just keeps expanding. I never know what I'm going to say when I give a talk. So we'll begin. I want to thank Owsley and Sarah and the organizers and Juniper and the Braylon and Brian and the backstage crew. We are in an extraordinarily wonderful production environment here. I want to thank anyone watching for tuning in. That's a phrase that has decreasing relevance as people my age leave the stage. Or let's see, clicking in might be more appropriate. And I want to thank Melvin for setting up a very important distinction that I'm going to be speaking to momentarily. So this is a sort of the position of the neuroscientist. We have so much we don't know about the brain, and the brain looms large. It also looms large in our culture, as Anne was pointing out. And what I'd like to do in the short time we have together now is to change the relationship here and increase the whole human being and decrease the neurohegemonic sensibility that the culture often has floating in it. And my poor Photoshop skills let the shadow of the former large brain point to the biases I have as a neuroscientist. First, I want to make one simple point. Our consciousness, as Melvin was talking about it, is primary. It's all we have access to in reportable terms. There's a distinction, and this idea is put forward by the French philosopher Michel Bitbol and the Chileno neuroscientist, philosopher, contemplative practitioner Francisco Varela. There's an important distinction, and that distinction was made in the practices that Melvin led us through at the beginning of this session. We need to distinguish between that which is reportable of our experience and the simple fact of awareness. So let's do another very brief exercise. Let's see if we can attend to something about the structure of our awareness by a linguistic trick. I want you to think that you're not at a talk. You're not in a theater. You're not in a seat. I am not talking. These are sounds that are just appearing in the environment. And you're not in any particular identity. You're an awake animal existing. is there any structure to your experience that appears in the field of awareness? This observation of the difference in the terrain this is part of what is the terrain of contemplative practice. And what it can allow is insight into the nature of our existence as it comes to us. It can illuminate our life world, if you will. As a neuroscientist, in contradistinction to the tyranny of the unconscious, I'm unbelievably blown away by the operation of intelligence below our level of conscious awareness. If any of you were at the panel last night with wonderful composers speaking about the actual practice of their craft of composing music, it often happens by either seeking silence. Valerie Coleman was speaking about trying to seek silence, but if she doesn't find it, the silence finds her from which music arises, whether she's in the shower or going about daily life. There are so many features of the world building our body-minds do for us to enable us to be stable in a place. There's a really interesting, very simple exercise. So move your eyes to one side of the stage and then to the other. And just do that a few times. And you notice that the stage sort of stays stable. Now, gently take your dominant hand index finger and gently poke one of your eyeballs. Very, very gently. And you'll notice that the whole room goes up and down.
I don't want to do that.
So how's that? So your brain knew where you were going to move your eyes to that you didn't know, and remapped your visual field representation in your brain so that when your eyes stopped moving, it lined up with where your eyes had been. This is a marvelous piece of biological reality. There's a great TED Talk by Anil Seth called "Your Brain Hallucinates Your Conscious Reality." Since 2017, it's been viewed 14.5 million times. There's a phenomenon that's called the watching eyes effect. There was an experiment in a pub which had brick columns, and so people are drinking and eating in the dining areas around these columns. And on one of the columns was put a drawing of a pair of eyes. Just a drawing, not a photograph. And then the researchers doing this experiment determined that for the patrons who were drinking and eating, who could see the watching eyes, the servers were left larger tips. This is called the watching eyes effect, and it's well known. So here's a photograph from the New York City subway system. There is less crime in the areas where these eyes are mosaicked into the tile work. This one I love. This is... So recently there have been theories that just seeing an eye looking directly at you activates non-consciously self-referential processing, thoughts about yourself, in a positive light that makes you want to be pro-social. Imagine if every seat in this hall had a pair of eyes on it. We have t-shirts with a direct eye, whether you have eye contact or not. So there is another point I want to make, laughter aside. There is a yawning gap between our knowledge of the tissue of the brain and the first-person nature of our experience as we've been talking about it thus far. So here, let's see if this Yes, I can actually maybe do this. No, not working. It's all right. Well, we will, all right, here we are. Okay, so this is a very recent image that was published in Science this past May of a human neuron from a remarkable multi-year project by Jeff Lightman and his colleagues at Harvard. They received from a neurosurgical patient 1 cubic millimeter of an epileptic patient's hippocampus, a part of the brain that's really critical for integrating experience into memory. 1 cubic millimeter. A cubic millimeter, just for a kind of ballpark estimate, is not much bigger than the ball point of a medium ballpoint pen. So just think about that. And what they did is they froze that cubic millimeter of brain tissue and they sectioned it into 30,000 slices per millimeter. And they digitized it at the resolution of the cellular anatomy. So this one neuron, each of these little boutons, these little protuberances on the dendrites or the input areas to this neuron, is receiving input from another neuron or series of neurons. And so you have about thousands of connections for one cell, but this cell is actually in isolation. Now this cubic millimeter, when they digitized it in an electron microscope, they had to enlist Google to help them line up all these slices that they took from this 1 millimeter. And the total of the 1 cubic millimeter was 1,500 terabytes of storage for a ballpoint pen point size part of the brain. So if you actually wanted to do this for the whole brain, it would be 195 million terabytes, wow, which is about 200 times larger than all of the videos on YouTube. And that's one person. And that's not that, and that's one moment in time of an absolutely dynamic, changing biological reality. Yeah? So when you look at textbooks about, nerve cells and you're learning physiology and biology class, you tend to see neurons that are separate from each other. These are just two examples of pyramidal cells from the cerebral cortex of a mouse. But in reality, if you look at that purple arrow, there's no free space in the brain. This is actually the structure as a solid little core sample, like what we do when we try to age ice in Antarctica. We take core samples. Here's a core sample from the brain of a mouse. Everything is closely packed, whether it's capillaries or glial cells which support, and every year we learn more about how glial cells, in addition to neurons, are part of the functioning of the nervous system. This is a very small scale. That's only 7/1000ths of a millimeter across there. So now we're going to zoom in on a synapse. And the synapse is the connection between those cells that come into providing information into a given neuron, and they connect to what's called the dendritic spines of other neurons where the information is going to flow down into the next cell. These spines come and go, and if you spent 3 hours in this room, the dendritic spines of your primary visual cortex, some would retract and others would grow, optimizing your visual system for the illumination, colors, and contrast of this visual environment. So our brains are in some sense a kind of dynamic glove to the world, fitting itself to the fingers of existence. Don't ever say I said that. So here, this is now one of those single connections between neurons, of which we have trillions and trillions. I didn't go calculate how many synapses there are in the brain. There was a recently very small section which detailed 150 million synapses in a very small area. But this is an artistic conception of heroically achieved biological knowledge of everything that we know at the time. This is from 2014, of the molecular biological machinery inside one of those connections between a neuron. And so you can actually talk about spiritual imagination. You can imagine that something has happened. The nerve cell to which this is attached has received a triggering signal, and there's an electrical wave coming down the axon of that neuron, and the ionic flow that is moving, changing the surface voltage of this cell, has opened calcium channels that now are going to change the structure of proteins holding these little synaptic vesicles. These have neurotransmitter in them, and the proteins that are holding them in this matrix, these squiggly little structures here, they change shape and release the synaptic vesicles, and they migrate down and fuse with the, here, let's just see what I can do. Does this? Well, yeah, well, there we are. They fuse with the membrane like this right here, and we now have a little squirt of neurotransmitter that's happened. And if you think about that happening at the scale that it exists in terms of the large numbers, you can create a fantasy of a weather system of dynamic change in the brain. And then we say, well, how does the brain make consciousness? So what does this do? This gap leads to the active presence of mystery. Seeing this gap motivates intellectual humility and compassion for our desire to explain in human understandable terms the nature of reality. So one of my dear friend and inspiration and colleague and mentor and just someone that I deeply influenced my life, Francisco Varela, also someone that Anne has been very close to. And he says in 1984, in an interview with Roshi Joan Halifax before she was a Roshi, science at its core, its active living core, is pure contemplation. The best science is always done with that kind of delight and enjoyment of the mystery. So I will leave you with one quote that a friend of mine, David McMahon, who is a religious studies scholar, wrote important books on the history of Buddhist modernism, presented at a talk that happened some time ago from Alvin Noe, the philosopher at Berkeley of consciousness. To understand consciousness, the fact that we think and feel and that a world shows up for us, we need to look at a larger system of which the brain is only one element. Consciousness is not something the brain achieves on its own. Consciousness requires the joint operation of brain, body, and world. Indeed, consciousness is an achievement of the whole animal in its environmental context. To have a mind requires more than a brain. Thanks for your conscious attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cliff. I would like to thank you, I think, for shaking my faith in my own understanding of consciousness, which is to say who I really am and what this reality we are experiencing together right now really is. That can be rather uncomfortable, but indeed that lack of knowing may in fact be the birth of wisdom. And so I take away from Cliff's talk that whatever it is that we're experiencing now, whoever it is that we are now, is both mysterious and miraculous. And I thank you for that message. Our final speaker today is a friend of mine and somebody I admire greatly as a Buddhist teacher, Gaylon Ferguson, PhD. He's led mindfulness meditation retreats since 1976. After receiving a doctorate in cultural anthropology from Stanford, he taught at the University of Washington in Seattle and at Naropa University in Colorado. In addition to many articles and essays, he has written 3 books: Natural Wakefulness on the 4 Foundations of Mindfulness, Natural Bravery on Fear and Fearlessness, and Welcoming Beginner's Mind. Gaylon's talk today is entitled Understanding Our Experience of Consciousness, which presents the central idea in Buddhist psychology, or the central idea in Buddhist psychology is an invitation for us to directly experience via first-person inquiry our consciousness. Gaylon.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you to all of the previous comments. I feel stunned almost by a sense of the history of this gathering, a Festival of Faiths, and I think it was very helpful to place this within the context of that 1893, and then the digital neurons, and it sort of stops the mind. I had wanted to offer into this conversation experiential exercise, and I thought that might be different than what was, but it turns out that others have also done that. So I was going to offer that exercise. I'm going to give a little lead-in to frame it as to why that we might do that particular exercise, what it might be about. And then after we've done the exercise, again, looking into our own experience of consciousness, then I want to say a little bit about some of the implications or suggestions that might come out of doing that exercise and doing similar contemplative inquiry, it's sometimes called, or first-person inquiry. So the topic for our panel, as given to us, was consciousness. And as we've seen so far, consciousness is, in a sense, the most obvious aspect of being human. Human consciousness is with us from the moment that we wake up, our waking consciousness. Even during sleep, we may remember a dream later. So dreaming consciousness, we've seen that consciousness is something that we can't get out of. And in a sense, some of this is reminding me of, there's an old cartoon or a joke about if you want to understand water and you ask a fish in the river about the water and they, water, what's that? We're swimming in consciousness, so it's elusive. So that phrase, the elusive obvious, it's something that's pervasive with us all the time. It's every day. It's not just special or extraordinary moments of consciousness or altered states of consciousness or higher consciousness or pure consciousness. It's every kind of consciousness from morning, noon, and night, from the first moment we wake up, even including into our sleep. So given that, it's elusive obvious. I'm reminded of a saying by one of the saints that, I think it's St. Augustine, if you ask me what time is, before you ask me, I know time. I know what time is. But once someone asks me, I don't know. And so when Melvin led us in that exercise at the very beginning of looking at, well, there's consciousness that's different than hearing the sound of someone coughing or seeing these lights or seeing whatever we're seeing. I don't know where to begin to answer that in some way. Like, what is that talking about? And yet it seems worthwhile to look and maybe wonder, which is what I'm left with at the end of the talk about a sense of wonder at consciousness, a sense of awe. as my students often would say, awesome. It's in a sense, the questions themselves, I think there's a saying by a German poet, as time goes on, maybe we'll come to love the questions. That very interest in understanding consciousness is itself, aside from whether we arrive at a fixed and somewhat dogmatic truth according to any particular tradition or form of scientific knowledge or so forth. I'm not sure that's actually what we're aiming for. The only other comment that just to lead into this exercise is there's a saying from an early Greek philosopher named Heraclitus. And Heraclitus said, "We are estranged from that with which we're most familiar," which is a strange thing to say in a way. We've lost touch with something very familiar to us. How could that be possible? Familiar, the English word, comes from family, or is related to family. So family, the place where we're introduced to the human community, to being part of the human community, right? That happens in the family situation. And of course, there are sometimes tragic events and all kinds of things, but family is definitely that place of primary being welcomed, you could say, into being human. This is how we say goodnight. This is how we have a birthday party. So it's something very familiar to us, consciousness, our experience, and yet we've lost touch with it, Heraclitus is saying, a long, long time ago. So that seems true that yesterday there was mention in one of the panels of the speed of our culture is such that we often are missing the life that we're seeking out there to get to more of it and going right past it in some way. So we've lost touch with something very basic, perhaps with our own humanness in a certain way, right? We're certainly familiar with being human because we all are human, yes? So how could we lose touch with our humanity, the feeling of being human, our human-heartedness? And yet that's possible. I think perhaps we could even say there's a risk of what happens as we lose touch. So in part, this exercise and similar exercises, experiential exercises, are about let's touch in with something very basic, very ordinary. We're not looking for anything ecstatic or superhuman or anything, just a basic aspect of being human. And I thought to look into our sense perceptions, our seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, just a little bit, to do the exercise in terms of welcoming what are called our sense consciousnesses. So what we're going to do in the exercise could be framed as a way of knowing, a first-person inquiry, first-person knowing. The question will be, what do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel? What do I think? That's first-person knowledge, right? Second person could be in a dialogue situation where someone shares, well, this is how the pandemic felt for me. This is how this month has felt for me. And we listen. And dialogue is based on a kind of second person. And then third person is she, he, they, it, that. That was that experience. That was called objective knowledge, right, at a certain point, and was definitely considered far more valuable to the exclusion in a certain setting, even I'm trained in part in religious studies, even in the study of religion, sort of. What you would think the first thing you might want to do is ask people, well, what's your experience of that ceremony? What's that like? What did that feel like? What happens in your feelings, in your emotional intelligence around that ritual? And yet, no, we're not interested in that. We want to get at what's actually going on. So in the exercise, I'm just going to guide you. I'll do a minute or so of, it's called the welcoming exercise. So for the next minute or so, and this is not meditating, it's not mindfulness, it's not prayer, it's not any of the various, there's all kinds of things that I'm sure all the people listening to this have encountered or heard of. We saw the Time magazine cover on the mindful revolution. This is not mindfulness. I'm not asking you to pay close and non-judgmental attention to your experience. I'm asking just to welcome, to begin with, your experience of your body, any sensations in your body as you're sitting here. Not a subtle body or inner body or anything, just ordinary body. my arm, my legs, my chest, right. And as we're doing this, we'll hear things like someone coughed. We'll see things. So just allow those, welcome those as well as we're going along. And then welcome anything emotionally. This would be important for emotional intelligence. What's our emotional weather this morning, this afternoon? How are we feeling as we are here? What's the inner weather like? Just welcome however it is. We're not trying to change it, make it better or improve it or get it to be 2.0 or 3.0 version. Just welcome however we feel, happy, sad. Just welcome our emotional life, our felt sense of feeling. Sound of coughing. Again, all of this continues as we're going along. This is not an exclusive focus or anything. Just welcoming. The body might continue welcoming things. Oh, my stomach growled or whatever it might be. And then welcome your thoughts as well. If you're thinking about the past, if you have a memory, if you're thinking about next week and you're anticipating, you have a project in the future, welcome that thought about the future. What will next week be like? What will this month be like? What will this country be like in next year? If you have thoughts, allow those thoughts and welcome those thoughts. We are not meditating, remember? We're not trying to come back to a present or anything. There's no focus with this. I'm just kind of giving you some suggestions as we go along. Body, emotion, thoughts. And then in the room where we are, what do you see? Welcome any visual form. What color, what shape? What do you see? What's the pattern? Just welcome your seeing. And if you hear anything, welcome whatever you hear. And just allow this sense of spaciousness and interest, inquisitiveness, curiosity. What is our experience? As it's happening, welcoming it. It's even before even asking what it is, which is an investigation or an inquiry. It's not so much trying to see its nature. What is the nature of consciousness? Or all of these incredible questions. What is this? Just that we're alive as ordinary human beings with bodies, feelings, thoughts, cognitive processes, environments, sights, sounds. The arts have been an important part of this festival. All of the arts come out of sense perceptions, right? When we dance, when we make music, when we say poetry. So we're just, that human inheritance, just kind of valuing that or appreciating that. We're alive. We're not looking for anything special or blockbuster, just ordinary aliveness and welcoming that. Good. So what? What does this suggest, or what might we learn if we did this, again, let's say tomorrow or over time? Well, one thing that most of us notice who've done exercises like this, so-called spiritual exercises, contemplative exercises, which seem to be related to first-person inquiry, a term that Francisco Varela, I think, used fairly early on. We notice that the mind is almost always moving from this to that to that to this. Sometimes people say like a grasshopper. It hops and then it hops. And that's even slow because this is like a grasshopper that's had too much coffee, right? And it sort of hops and hops and hops very quickly. And sometimes in the tradition that's talked about as a monkey mind, that our monkey mind has a mango, but it sees a coconut. And it's like, oh, over there, that would be better. And then once it has a coconut, it sees banana. So we notice that this is the mind of, I guess we would call it distraction. And there are studies about what's going on with technology digital technology and the digital world in terms of our attention, consciousness, and our being human. So leaving that aside as a small question for the moment, if we notice this movement of mind, or what's called distraction, we now know that available to us are many, many ways of cultivating a stability of mind, a steadiness of mind. The shamatha project that was mentioned, this word shamatha refers to peacefully staying, that we can actually stay with our experience moment to moment, and that can be cultivated. A person can do that. Any of us could do that. And it turns out that in all our relationships, that's valuable. It's always a telltale if I have to ask, can you say that again, what you were telling me, this important thing that because I was thinking about what happened yesterday or tomorrow, I didn't actually hear what you said? So that kind of a presence in a social, relational way with each other could be very valuable, yeah? Then the other quality that we may notice as we just pause and welcome is that there's a habitual default setting that sort of comes back to me. And me, how's me? A kind of anxiety about me and how me is doing. And there's a way in which that's a kind of contraction and feels constricted, almost slightly like being in a cocoon. There's one image for it. And so noticing that's also one of our mental habits, you could say. It's something that our consciousness does. It kind of contracts. Noticing that, it turns out that, thinking of the past and those folks gathered in 1893, human beings have passed on to us many ways of cultivating empathy and compassion, loving kindness and love. So there are ways of working with that contraction, that kind of fearful, to ease it somewhat and expand into a larger sense of empathy and compassionate action that could come out of that sense of feeling with and feeling others. So both of those are suggested just by the little exercise that we did for a few minutes there. So our topic, Melvin has several times said this, is not just theoretical or philosophical or metaphysical or something abstract and whatever. This topic of consciousness actually has to do with what would be a good life. What is a good neighborhood, good community, good society, good bioregion? How would we care for the region that we live in and nature and other life forms? So consciousness is not just out there, or that abstract subject. It turns out to have to do with our human life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaylon. I think your excellent presentation has demonstrated to us that Buddhism is not necessarily some exotic, mystical foreign religion, but is very much about our lives now, completely up to date, completely practical, and completely relevant. The other thing I want to thank you for is bringing the element of heart into this discussion through your use of the word welcoming. Because welcoming, of course, is a sense of caring, a sense of compassion, a sense of positivity, and that's central to any form of contemplation or inquiry of any sort, that we have to bring not simply our minds and intellect to the process, but actually our own heart of caring is essential to any form of human progress and technique that leads to human progress. So now, we can invite our sense consciousness to enjoy the sound of Barbara's beautiful cello playing. I think as we listen and contemplate that our consciousness is experiencing this, probably that's not going to distract us from the beautiful sounds. It's actually going to make them more enjoyable and more intimate.
Thank you. Happy to be back today. Okay. Is the mic on? Yeah. Great. Happy to be back today to share more music with you. But today, before I play, I would like to introduce you to my life partner, my cello. So this is Giovanni. And Giovanni is named after his maker, who was Giovanni Battista Gabrieli. And Gabriele created this gorgeous hunk of wood in Florence, Italy in 1752. Yes. I was lucky enough to find Giovanni in an instrument store in 1986, so we have been together for a long time. And like most musicians and their instruments, we have a very close relationship. So just about 2 decades before Giovanni was created, the composer, Johann Sebastian Bach, created 6 monumental works for solo cello. He called them suites. And this was the first time in the history of music that any composer had thought to write music of such complexity and emotional richness for a cello all by itself. Bach was very aware that he was really introducing the sound world of the cello to his listeners because they had never heard one play all alone. So I'm going to play 2 short movements from the first suite that he wrote, Prelude and Sarabande. And the Sarabande is a dance movement. It's a slow, stately dance, which is the emotional core, the emotional heart of the suite. And the first movement I'm going to play, called Prelude, is kind of stream of consciousness writing by Bach. So we've had a lot of talk about consciousness. And this prelude is a real glimpse into the conscious and unconscious world of Johann Sebastian Bach.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. That beautiful music, those beautiful sounds, I think, feel like a brilliant fourth offering of wisdom for us here today in a different form, but struck right at the heart of who we are and what our consciousness is through all that beauty. So we have about 15 minutes now, going a bit over, and that'll allow us an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion among our panelists. And I would like to start off by posing a question and put you on the spot. Because in the end, we've learned a lot about what is known and what is unknown about consciousness, which, as you said, Gaylon, is perhaps the hardest thing to know because we are completely and utterly immersed into it. It may very well be actually the definition of our reality, and therefore it's hard to know its true nature. Having considered, though, its nature, how then do we work with our consciousness, either our knowledge of consciousness, our lack of knowledge of consciousness, or simply the consciousness itself, in ways that benefit our lives and benefit our world and benefit the lives of others? So if each of you could say one takeaway for all of us today after this panel, what should we take away from this discussion about the nature of consciousness that we should do or live in order to be able to work with our consciousness, as our program title suggests, in order to maximize its potential or benefit?
You're looking at me. Everyone's trying.
They're trying to avoid answering themselves.
So
We're looking away from
there's a few things that I didn't say, but then in my talk, but that I would say now that's important, I think, which is that associated with any kind of understanding of consciousness is a duty of care. That and there's a relationality. We mostly in our tradition, if I stumble over a brick, I don't say, "Oh, excuse me." But if I bump into another human being, I will, so I do think that consciousness, there's an ethic that is baked into any kinds of larger conversations that we want to have about consciousness, because through consciousness raises the possibility of relationality and our duty to embrace an ethic of care in that space of relationality. And I'll say one other thing, and then comes back a little bit to my interest in the places where we have different kinds of conversations. In this class that I'm teaching this semester, the very first day, one of my students asked, "So, Professor Harrington, what's our working definition?" And I forgot what I said then, but I remember about 6 or 7 weeks in, I had a better answer, which is that's not the right question. And that wasn't just I think, a way to, I think, I am drawn to the distinction that the anthropologist Gregory Bateson made between maps and territories. The minute we begin to talk, we're in the space of the map. And maps are useful. Maps are, different kinds of maps are created for different kinds of purposes. And so that's one of the reasons why the different kinds of conversations we might have about consciousness don't always connect up, because they're maps designed to enable certain kinds of projects to happen. And so I think maybe it does come back to the duty of care, like a consciousness or an awareness about what kind of map am I working with and what kinds of benefits or possibilities are enabled by this map, by this space, and what aren't. And the mystery that Cliff has that's the territory. But the maps, we can't live in the world. We can't navigate in the world without our maps. And as we navigate into new spaces, we will need different kinds of maps. So the map that you need in an ICU when you're trying to decide whether or not to take a person off life support is a very different map than Cliff uses when you're in a neuroscience laboratory. They're not, one isn't not true and the other is more true. They're just different.
Oh, please.
All right, Cliff.
Thank you for the question.
You're welcome.
So the first word there are two words that came up for me. One was safety, and the other was curiosity. And have a great rest of your existence.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for being here. Thank you for being here. We are going over. You do not clearly need to go over. So one of the things that I think it's very important to consider is that having in the working space of your world knowledge about your own life, the idea that there is an awareness that you can take refuge in, that is a phenomenon that you can see, even if you cannot name it, you can experience it as a kind of knowing or witness to the circumstances of your existence, whatever those circumstances are. And you do not have to be defined by those circumstances. And that includes conditions of suffering, conditions of oppression, and that conditions of privilege. And when I was part of a meeting with the Mind and Life Institute that was to include the Dalai Lama on indigenous African humanistic philosophy of Ubuntu, that I am because you are, our embeddedness in each other. This curiosity is not just curiosity about how things work, but it's coming from the perspective of common humanity. I am a human being, someone else who may be very different in their predilections, their worldview, what they cling to, what they care about. They are also a human being. And so they also have an awareness that is different from the contents of that consciousness that they're experiencing. So how can I be motivated to relate to that with which they may not be in touch with at that moment, to collectively point toward the miracle that we're both alive? To me, thinking about contemplative inquiry is what Anne spoke about, this duty of care. And otherwise it just goes into a sort of narcissistic, I want to use the phrase navel gazing because it's hackneyed, but there is a way in which one can become self-obsessed. And so I think for me, time in meditation kind of lifts a window to view the human condition. And that whatever technique one might use to lift that window, the point for me is to look through.
We seem to all agree on the ethics of care as the main thread. I'm trying to remember, both at Emory University and at Stanford, there's a cultivating compassion program. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, it's cognitive-based compassion training is the training, and they've just recently renamed the Emory Tibet Science Initiative to a Center for Compassion.
All right. So that's to me, the most practical thing is to cultivate compassion in our world. Yeah. There are many ways to do that, and we find them and engage them more and more. Yeah.
And what is the connection between consciousness and compassion?
I guess I'm saying
I'm not asking that to challenge your answer. I'd like to know.
No, compassionate consciousness, cultivating compassionate consciousness.
Compassionate consciousness.
Yeah, yeah. Which is both that which is not caught in the whatever the objects are, and it's that has some ethical concern for how is that person that I just bumped into? Or
Sorry
whatever.
So we just have a couple of minutes left, not too many, but I invite any of our panelists to say any, I don't want to use the phrase last words, that doesn't sound right, but anything else.
I'm going to break the frame. And is there anybody that has a question there that you really want to voice out? And I'll say it into the mic. Evidently, the mics can't travel. But
I think I'd love that if we could
okay,
involve
please.
for just a few minutes or two.
It'll have to be a short question. No.
Anybody? Anything? Oh, in the back, please.
Thank you.
Sure.
So most people are familiar with neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
Ways to change the structure of the brain. And we know from the work of Dan Siegel that a lot of meditation works with the prefrontal cortex where compassion, empathy, and so forth are centered there. So we can alter that through meditation, strengthen the synapses there, and also through drugs. So here's my question. I have severe tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears. And it suddenly came on about 2 years ago. And there's a device that was just approved by the FDA to help change a person's acceptance of the tinnitus and lower the volume of the tinnitus, which is a phantom sound. It's called linear. And so it's actually changing my mind and my brain to be more tolerant of the horrible sound. Is that ever possible to do with compassion?
Can you answer this?
Do we need to repeat the elements?
So we need to repeat the
please,
question.
please do. Yes, thank you.
So the question concerns the nature of neuroplasticity. This gentleman has got a device that allows him to listen to sound of a particular kind that matches his tinnitus in ways that allow him to accept the aggravating nature of it. Yes, you have I'm not...
Sorry, it doesn't mask the tinnitus. It's a bimodal stimulation.
Right. For the purpose of our tiny bit of time.
Fractal sounds and stimulation of the tongue. It's a bimodal stimulation.
Okay, so we have a stimulation of the tongue and ears to allow for the acceptance experientially of the painful sound of tinnitus that's ringing in one's ears. And is it possible through meditation to cultivate neuroplastic change in compassion?
So is that an analogy, I think, right? That can one similarly, through meditative practice, enhance one's ability to deal with the aggravations and of the world through... Is that the...
No. I'm asking, is it like that the linear device can change my brain and my mind's relationship to the sound? Can we also develop a device possibly to enhance our compassion?
Oh, forget about meditation. Let's get the technology.
So
I think that was...
So there are people who are interested in providing technological aids. These are not individuals that I'm working with, and I tend to have the idea that that's not the best approach, since we have this extraordinary, capable technology that is the product of several billion years of evolution on this planet, and so there are, I think, much more direct ways. But the first thing I want to say is that the idea that neuroplasticity is good is problematic. Neuroplasticity is getting better at whatever you repetitively do. And so if you do lousy things, you become an expert at those things. Part of why behavioral change is so hard is that the way we are in the world, the way we parent, the way we are in relationship with each other, they're the product of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of tiny training instances. And in order to change things that might be fundamental about our way we relate to the world, we need to expect a large number of training instances in a more adaptive direction. And of course, that fact motivates a desire for shortcuts. The problem becomes when the battery runs out of your device and you're left, or you left your phone and the app is pinging you to remember to take a mindful moment, but you forgot because you didn't get the ping. So now the device has reconditioned us and neuroplastically reorganized us to need the device. There's a whole world of tool use where, the brain representation of things that you use all the time, to the brain, they become part of your body. Unfortunately, we're not, I'm happy, we're going to be able to talk in the lobby, but we truly are in the last 60 seconds of this session.
Thank you, though.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you to all. I mean, each of us is, in our own ways, on a lifelong journey to try to understand ourselves, our reality, and in effect the nature of our consciousness, which may be at the root of those experiences. And each of our three panelists today, I feel, has given me, and I hope you as well, much to help us on that lifelong journey. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.